And I think this letter is perfect, number one, for the Lent season we're entering.
Hmm.
And number one, I think every Christian in America should read this letter.
Mm.
So if you can make that happen, James, through your podcast.
Oh, yeah, because there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast.
uh, but I think what I think for me what is so powerful about Romero's heart and theology is this, I don't know how to label it, but almost this incarnation of the good news,
Mm.
right?
You're listening to Practice Not Perfect, a podcast about practice that is rooted in the Christian spiritual tradition. I'm your host, James Matichuk. For our episode today, I got to talk to my friend Julio Hernandez, and we got together to discuss Óscar Romero and his first pastoral letter, and also just his life and witness. And as always, when you get to talk to Julio, he has lots of stories of where he has seen God at work in the lives of people he has encountered in the work for justice. I know you're going to love this conversation. And here it is.
Hello, everybody. I'm here with Julio Hernandez, who I can legitimately say is a good friend of mine. We did go to seminary together at Regent College, and you were actually one of the first people I met when I got
No
to.
way.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's
Yeah.
so cool.
Yeah, I think Sarah and I were up before things started, and we were in the atrium, and you walked in with our mutual friend Alex and introduced yourself. So you're literally one of the first people I met. And then we were part of a justice-themed care group together, which you led, called Micah 6-8, and we attended the same church in Vancouver. You and your wife Lisa, I think, obviously we were very good friends there, and both of you kind of demonstrated to me what it is to show up for people, particularly people on the margins. So I am very excited about this conversation. But of course, you gave me work to do because we are going to discuss Óscar Romero's first pastoral letter, his letter to the Easter Church that's dated April 10th, 1977. For anyone who is unaware of Óscar Romero, I don't know why you would be at this point, but he was, for most of his career, a fairly conservative Catholic. He had a degree in ascetical theology and was concerned about ways that Marxist ideas were infiltrating the church and some of the ways that the church was becoming too political. And he was chosen as the Archbishop of El Salvador, in part because he was seen as a conservative that would not challenge the status quo. And that did not work out the way anybody expected. Romero changed because of violence he had seen and been scandalized by, especially the death of his friend, Rutilio Grande, a Jesuit priest, a man whom he respected. And this happened a few weeks after Romero became the Archbishop. And then this was his first pastoral letter. And over the course of the 3 years of his archbishopric until his martyrdom, he became more and more vocal about injustices that he saw in El Salvador and became more and more in solidarity with the poor. I guess that's how I'd say it. But before we get into the content of that letter, I always begin with some practice questions. So Julio, what is one thing you have practiced a lot of in your life? And when I say this, it doesn't have to be anything particularly deep or spiritual, but maybe a skill you mastered, a hobby you enjoyed, an instrument you played, or a sport you did, or what's one thing you've practiced a lot of?
Boy, I wish I practiced a lot of an instrument. I tried guitar, but I'm not as good as James. I can play 3 chords, and I didn't stick with it. But surprisingly, the practice that has haunted me, that I've not been able to get away from in a good sense, has been biking.
Mm.
Ever since I was a little kid, we in the neighborhood, that was back in the day when there were BMX bikes and banana seats, and me and my friends would just make ramps so I grew up in apartments, and there's a big parking lot in the center of the complex and speed bumps, and we'd make ramps off the speed bumps, and we're just silly kids tinkering on bikes and putting little plastic on the tails on the back rims so it sounded like a motorcycle, and we'd ride around. And as I got older, we'd ride further and further. And the interesting thing is we had a bike trail near us, which, in the 80s, that's kind of strange. Um, so now seeing the explosion of bike trails has been really cool. And then my friend Alex, the one that you met at
Yeah.
Regent, Alex and I rode our bikes from Virginia to Oregon.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when you said biking, because I remember that was before I met either of you, but I've heard about that trip.
Yeah.
What's one thing that you have practiced but you no longer practice?
Wow, that's a good question. I'll be honest with very, very vulnerable and frank. I think I grew up in a very conservative Christian culture,
Mm-hmm.
and something I've been trying to not practice is the self-condemnation that I learned there and the shame.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Ooh, I hear you.
yeah, yeah. That's it. There's this. I just texted my wife this morning that practice has been transitioning from the voice of the accuser to the voice of the advocate,
Mm.
which I think for me has been a big transition in my own life.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm on a parallel journey in that respect. Wow. So I became aware of who Óscar Romero was when I was in my 20s. I got my hands on a book called The Violence of Love, which has selections of homilies, letters, various writings that Romero did. And that's when I heard about Romero. Now, this is where your stories and mine diverge a little bit, because I kind of wonder if there was any time in your life that you were not aware of who Romero was. But maybe you could share a little bit about your family story, your heritage, and maybe where Romero became an important voice for you.
Yeah, it's fascinating because when I was growing up, El Salvador was in the midst of a civil war.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up so my faith tradition, I grew up Baptist. My mom and my dad grew up Missionary Alliance in El Salvador, which is very rare because El Salvador, when they were there at that time, was about 96% Catholic. So it was very rare to be Protestant. They came to America actually in a rare time that was prior to the Civil War. They came in the 60s. So my mom's sister was here in America, and her and her husband parted ways. And so my mom came straight from high school to raise my cousin. So she came at 18, and my dad lost his father at 11, and my grandmother worked at the British Embassy and met a Puerto Rican man and got married, and he brought him to America. And both my parents knew each other from church in El Salvador. And when they arrived in America, they reunited, started dating, and got married. And the plan was to return, but then the Civil War began. So the interesting thing is I didn't grow up with Romero as central as most Salvadorans, and I didn't grow up in El Salvador as most of my peers did. So when I was in elementary school, I tell people that there are probably 5 Spanish-speaking people in my school, and 3 of us were related, of the same family.
Yeah.
I can even remember the first time I spoke English because they wanted to put me in ESL classes. English as a second language. That's what they called it when I was a kid. Now it has a different name depending on where you live.
Right.
So my mom kept telling them, and I remember this. It's funny because I found some of my report cards and started reading them, and they said the mother keeps saying he speaks English, but I wouldn't speak. And the reason is I guess I was just shy about speaking English, and I always assumed that everyone spoke Spanish. In my mind, I just thought, you speak Spanish at home and speak English in public. So I just assumed everybody understood Spanish. I didn't know that there was a difference. And then one day the UPS man came to our door and I answered the door and spoke to him. My mom ran up to me. She's like, "Oh my gosh, you can speak." And then that's when I started speaking English. But I'll say Romero has become more and more central in my life as I age. I think in high school, I discovered Henry Nouwen. And I
Yeah.
think that one of the neat things is my youth pastor, one of his best friends was a Catholic priest. So when he was away, he would come and preach at our youth group. So even though I grew up very conservative, there were not these strict lines between Catholic and Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
So even in our own family, I would say there was not these strict lines as well. Like even in post college, I led a Romero study at my. I was a part of a Baptist church plant in Arlington,
Mm-hmm.
and I led a Romero study, and my mom was part of it, and my dad was part of it, and they were really interested in the study. It was really powerful. So I think my journey with Romero as I've aged, I've been able to. I think for me, I've been struggling to find a spirituality that both recognizes the pain and the injustice of the world
Mm.
and also has a hope for the transformation of that pain, that there's gospel hope.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what blows me away about the Salvador. So I started doing some work around liberation theology,
Yeah.
specifically John Sobrino in El Salvador. And I discovered something that I had no idea that was going on at the time, that during the unrest of the 80s in Central America, as Medellin and Vatican II were taking place throughout Latin America,
Yeah.
the CIA labeled this theology liberation theology. So, for example, the Sobrino, Ignacio Ellacuría, Romero, they didn't label themselves as liberation theologians. They labeled themselves as Salvadorian theologians.
Mm.
Even Sobrino said, "I never taught a course on liberation theology."
Yeah.
But then when they were labeled as liberation theology, that's when the death threats came. And so the CIA labeled liberation theology as subversive to U.S. interests. And so for me, this intersection of the justice work that they were doing, yet their faith and their commitment to Jesus, I think for me has really been very, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of another word other than kind of feel like I'm eating a well-balanced diet.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
I feel like before I was looking for something where I could really feel nourished, and I've really found a great source of wealth within the Salvadoran theologians, and been blown away by their community.
Mm-hmm.
Romero was outside of that community, but then he was brought in and mentored, specifically at the University of Central America. There's this strong community and strong commitment to the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Romero had this strong theological convictions, his strong convictions of the church, but yet had a very big fear of Marxism,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
I think a lot of that had to do with Pope John Paul II's fear of the Marxism he experienced in Europe and Poland. And I think it didn't translate directly to what was going on in Latin America. So he carried that fear from Europe to Central America, but then seeing the reality of what was happening in El Salvador really transformed him.
Mm. Well, so I mean, you're probing some of what I kind of want to say before we get into the letter here, but some of the background to Romero's work that I think people need to understand Romero well. Part of that was this theological shift in the Catholic Church. So in 1962, the Pope at the time, I think John the 23rd or something like that. I'm not Catholic, so I might get that wrong. Convened Vatican II, which was this ecumenical council that was to bring fresh air into the church, and they kind of rethought a lot of things in terms of the Catholic stance to other Christians and also liturgy and a whole host of other things. It was a big shift in Catholic theology. And underrepresented at Vatican II was, Latin American Christians. And then the most important council of looking at the implications of that was this 1968 conference in Medellin, Colombia, which kind of gave language to the preferential treatment of the poor, and also kind of was the start of what we now call liberation theology in terms of thinking about base communities and some of those other things. And that's kind of in the background theologically. What was going on in El Salvador because it was pre-Civil War when Romero became Archbishop, but
no. There was a lot of violence at the time.
Yeah.
So what's really fascinating is in the letter he talks about when the Archdiocese of San Salvador was established, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 1913. So he was 3 years old. He was born in 1917. So it's so fascinating to see kind of this.
Yeah.
History is not that far from us, right? Like almost we could touch, I'm just so fascinated. Kind of the dynamics of, I'm just blown away how time is not really that far. I don't know if that makes sense, but so yeah, El Salvador is going through this difficult period of a lot of violence. They elect Romero because they think that he's going to maintain the status quo. Basically, even if you go today, El Salvador seems like a feudal state. There's very, very ultra wealthy and very poor. The normal Salvadoran lives about $350 a month. I was there. So because of the work that I do, I've been able to go about 4 times in the last 5 years. One of the trips I was on recently, we went to a lecture at the University of Central America where the 6 Jesuits were killed. One of the helpers and her daughter were killed.
Mm-hmm.
And the professor said to us, in El Salvador, there are people that fly to Paris once a week to buy things, and they come back, and it's normal for them. And I thought in my own head, this is ridiculous. I've never seen this before. My family's from El Salvador. When I would go, honestly, I would travel to where my family's from, and it's a small little part of the capital, a poor part of the San Salvador. So I didn't really see anything other than that. I never traveled to the nice part of El Salvador. Personally, I'd never seen what's called the Zona Rosa, the area where the ultra wealthy are. So I went there, and we went to a cafe owned by one of the former president's daughters. And the cafe has a little balcony, and then you look down to the parking lot that has maybe about 30 spaces. Excuse me. And we look down, and in the parking lot, and we're talking about El Salvador where the roads are awful. There's potholes everywhere that could swallow up a trash can. You're talking about we saw Lamborghinis, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Porsches, and of course, in El Salvador, there's Toyotas next to them. But I was blown away. I said to myself, I've never seen anything like this. Personally, maybe other Salvadorans have had that experience themselves, but I personally had not seen that. And so basically, there was a civil war. The U.S. labeled it as communist versus democracy, but the reality was it was a military oligarchy versus the people. And and I think that this has kind of a leftover of the colonization that has gone on, of violence used to control the majority of the people. And sadly enough, that's reality today, where we see the current president was just elected yesterday, who is using extreme violence to control a rising gang problem. But sadly enough, the innocent are getting caught up in this, the poor are getting caught up in this. We were there, we took our church there, and we visited a school that was built upon where the city dump used to be. So they built a school there where people used to live. And the city is up on a plateau, and the poor part is in a part that goes down. There's a kind of a cliff, and there's a poor community below. And some of the missionaries live above and they teach English. So some of the kids would go up and learn English in the afternoons after school and then come back down. And one of the kids going back down to the poor village. So what happens is the police are caught up in this catch-22 because they're given quotas.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to arrest so many people who are supposed gang members. So they're under pressure. And so they'll round up anybody who's poor. So they rounded up this kid who at that time was wearing camouflage jeans. So apparently he was a gang member because he was wearing, and he was a kid committed to the church. He's a kid going to learn English on his free time.
Mm.
And they beat him. He spent 3 months in jail. And the mother met with the lawyer and they said, well, you're lucky he's still alive because he was meant to be dead.
Oof.
And that's all the justice he could get, is that he lived through that beating. Who knows what the long-term implications will be for health implications will be for his life. But that's just one of the many stories right now in El Salvador, that the innocent are being caught up in this. There's no civil rights. So before you had 24 hours to have charges put against you. Now it's 3 months. And then once you're in the system, you're now labeled as a criminal, and that will basically condemn you to poverty. And if you lose one income in a poor family already, that condemns the next generation to poverty as well.
So, Romero is in this culture where he begins to see violence. And I mentioned earlier, Rutilio Grande, I mean, that certainly his death affected Romero. There are other moments where he kind of confronts the violence that's around him. Before he's Archbishop, there's a village where 5 people are killed by the National Guard as kind of a shakedown. And Romero does raise his voice then, and there's no response.
Yeah.
So there's things that are shifting for him even before Rutilio Grande dies. So like, it's not just a one cause.
Yes. Yeah.
So
there's a whole process, right?
Yeah.
So actually, we were there just this past July in 2023, and we went to the village where Rutilio Grande was serving.
Tres Calles?
El Paisnal.
Okay.
And so, and we actually got to meet one of his catechists. He spoke to us, and actually, the older gentleman there's a older gentleman that was killed, and a young boy that was killed, and we met one of the descendants of the gentleman that was killed, and she sold little desserts outside the church that we got to share in. But the catechist said to us, he said that when Romero was made bishop, Rutilio said to him, there are serpents that are killing the peasants in my village. And Romero said to him, there are no serpents there. There's no such thing, because when he came on, he says, show me where the arms are, show me the communist priests. We're going to find them and take them out, right? But Rutilio is telling him, listen, the peasants are getting killed where I am. I'm just telling you what's happening. And so Romero says, there are no serpents there. And he goes, well, come and see. 3 days later, Rutilio is killed.
Oh, wow.
And then that's when Romero goes to El Paisnal, sees Rutilio, sees the 2 other people who were killed. And there is also that moment for him where the people say that it's as if Rutilio's spirit comes into Romero and transforms him. A lot of people say that was a major moment for him, a big shift.
Yeah.
And what's one of the kind of the names that Romero carries is voice of the voiceless.
Yeah.
So what's happening right now in this context is that there is no free press. There is no, the word for me, reality, doesn't have the same connotation in our context here that it does in El Salvador, because the media was well, let me rephrase that. Maybe we're starting to understand that now as we see, this kind of realities created that we see, probably we're starting to see now as we see alternate realities and
yeah. So I think what you're talking about is the way our justice system works on a different level for some citizens based on racial and cultural origin. So like in terms of how communities of color are policed, but also how what happens to people when they are incarcerated.
So basically in El Salvador, for example, there'd be a whole town massacred and the government would deny it. And so then Romero, one of the things that Romero became was a voice by saying, hey, listen, he would begin his homilies by reading names. So many people were disappeared, or this was what happened. And so then his voice became amplified throughout Central America because finally somebody was telling the truth. So there were different realities. There's the reality of the wealthy. So for example, John Sobrino, when he came to El Salvador, his whole mission was to civilize the uncivilized. Like one of his big hopes was to help people get married. But he had no idea what was going on. And one thing that blew him away was when he went to a visit at one of the Catholic high schools, where the wealthy kids were given machine guns so that when they walk home, if someone tried to do anything, they could kill the person. And so he said that the poor just there was no value to the life of the poor. A 16-year-old kid could kill a peasant for the mere act of saying something, so that for Sobrino, there was this moment for him of crisis of saying, there's a different value of life, right? And ultimately, God's greatest gift is life, and when we violate that, that's a major sin. And so, in this language that you hear in this letter, and you hear in Romero, when you hear the word reality, it has a very strong connotation, because oftentimes the reality of the life of the poor was denied, and was also and people said that was false. It didn't happen. Sadly, people disappeared. The military could come and pick you up. Who knows? Nobody knows whatever happened. Kids were given to the wealthy, people who couldn't have children. And so the poor kept saying, something's happening, we're getting killed. And the government saying, no, nothing's happening. If this person's not disappeared, they probably just left you. And what happened is people have started to flee and come to America or emigrate. And they're like, oh, they probably left. And so that is this complex context that as you read this letter too.
I want to just read a little section here that is where he kind of frames what he says in the letter. And he says, its purpose is simply in the daylight of this Paschal hour to present with a sincere offer to enter into dialogue with everyone on the church's identity and mission in these terms. Easter, the origin and content of the church, the sacrament and instrument of Easter, and the world, designated recipient of the truth and grace of Easter. And I thought as we go through, Easter, it is called the Easter Church. Like that's the title that's been appended to this letter. But Easter is a motif that never really leaves Romero. This was his first pastoral letter. His last homily also would have very much kind of the Easter themes of when he talks about the wheat that falls to the ground and dies will be resurrected. And I think in that homily, he says that if he dies, he will be resurrected in the hearts of the El Salvadorian people. So like Easter is a big thing for Romero. So what is he getting at when he talks about how Easter is the origin and content of the church?
Well, one thing that as a preface, as we discuss, I think to all the listeners, we are Protestants reading a letter from the Archbishop. So with that caveat, we humbly discuss this letter. With that caveat, and also recognizing that the Catholic Church sees him as a saint. I think that's important.
They got there.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, Rutilio Grande also might be recognized as a saint soon as well.
Yeah, you're right. No.
One thing that blows me away, so for example, in that intro to Violence to Love, I forgot who wrote it, but there's a phrase, there's a passage in there where they say, Romero said that the people make it easy for me to be their pastor, to be a good shepherd. And for me, there is this context that you need to go and meet the Salvadoran people because there's something special about the people.
Mm-hmm.
This letter in there is so full of hope because of the people. So there's a Romero, a Memories in Mosaic of Romero that talks about how Romero's door was always open for the people. Like people would go and meet him. I'm so blown away too by you can go see his home where he lived. He lived in a clinic for cancer patients where he would pray for them. The little chapel where he was assassinated was tiny.
Yeah.
I'm so blown away by his spiritual practice, his humility. Even though he was archbishop, he really had a simplicity to his lived faith. And what really, I think for me, really is just so profound is that he really lives this Easter message in a way that I don't think he would say he didn't choose it, right? It was something that was basically God chose him, right? It was almost like a moment of time where he prepared himself. He loved to read, he studied, but almost it was the circumstances that led him very much like Jesus. You hear this language in here of death and resurrection over and over again. And for me, it's so profound that he was not bishop for that long, right? Archbishop for that long.
Right.
In 1977, he dies in April 1977, and he dies in March of 1980. And you have, since 1913, you have three people who were archbishop.
Yeah.
64 years of three people. And he enters the church in one of the most tumultuous, violent times and has this courage, this inner strength. And this inner strength, I think, is really formed by the Salvadoran people, their faith and commitments. You even see, so when we went to El Paisnal to meet Rutilio Grande's a catechist, he said to us, so there are 5 kids when the military came, and they gave the children a choice whether to leave or to stay, and one child stayed, and he was actually named after Rutilio. He was given a name, and he chose to die, to be a martyr. Something that the Salvadoran theologians are trying to do then in this time is to redefine martyrdom. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a martyr? And there's a lot of writing that they're doing. Sobrino is one of them. Curia is one of them. Mm-hmm. I think Ignacio Curia, I really am sad that he was martyred because he had so much. He's a philosopher, theologian that died too young. He didn't finish his magnum opus that he was working on. Just a phenomenal thinker. He was the director of the University of Central America and really created a culture that said, we are here for the poor. Mm-hmm. We're an academic school, but really we're here for the poor. And that's reflected in the community they shared and why the military was so threatened by them. So for example, Sobrino, his whole idea is I'm going to come and civilize the uncivilized. But then he comes and he meets the Salvadoran people and is transformed. He's coming from Europe with this God is dead mentality of theology.
Sure.
And then he comes to El Salvador and is transformed by something really special going on. And Romero is just one of probably the tip of this iceberg of the spirituality that's really beautiful among the people. When you go into a Salvadoran community, I met this man who owns a small plane business throughout Latin America, And he says, I love El Salvador because when I go to El Salvador, people see you as people. They don't see you as a dollar sign. As opposed when I go to Costa Rica, it's the opposite. People see you as a dollar sign and not as a person.
Mm.
There's something really beautiful about the community in the midst of such violence and poverty. There's such care and love
Mm. Wow.
among the Salvadorans.
Yeah, I just as you were talking, I was thinking, because when you say when he talks about reality, when you mention themes like death and resurrection and this Paschal mystery, it rings a little bit differently if death is the experience that of the day.
Yes.
We're in a culture. I mean, I talk about the resurrection all the time in church, but we're in a culture that denies death by and large, or we try not to think about it. But you weren't afforded that luxury if you were a peasant in El Salvador.
Like even they say, Sabrina says, we cannot understand poverty.
Yeah.
He even calls it the wealthy majority. The wealthy minority.
Yeah.
The poor majority of the world. So we can give you stats. You can look at graphs. You can read books on it. But you have no understanding what it's like that to be poor in the majority world means that every day your life is at risk.
Mm.
And I don't think we in the wealthy minority understand that. And in America, in Ron Sider's book, Rich Christians in the Age of Poverty, of Hunger, they say if you own one car, you're in the top 1% of the world.
Yeah.
Americans have no idea, number one, how wealthy. So our standard of just our base level of middle class, we had no idea what that's like. And it's unsustainable for the world and what it takes to be at that level. So, for example, El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
Robert White, one of the ambassadors, said, why do we fear a country that you can get in a helicopter and get up and see the whole entire country from a helicopter?
Oof.
So we are sending $1 million a day to El Salvador during Carter's administration.
Yeah.
I worked on a movie project, on a documentary where I interviewed victims of torture in El Salvador. And this was when I was interviewing them during the time when the pictures of Abu Ghraib were coming out on Time magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And they said to me, I'll never forget this. They said, you see all those pictures? They said, they experimented on us before they went to the Middle East. All those things that you see, those distressing positions, they did that to us. The black hood they put on us, we just don't have pictures of them.
Mm.
Everything that we see, they did to us already. We know what it's like.
Wow. Just because you mentioned Carter, I just want to say this is that, I mean, Romero he did write a letter to Carter about the way his administration was funding the right wing elements in ways that were causing suffering, and why that's significant. I think Carter regrets some of his policies at the time, but he was given a Nobel Peace Prize for the way that he looked for nonviolent solutions much later. But as president, he was also responsible for kind of perpetuating violence in Latin America and in El Salvador. So
yeah. And I think that for what we're seeing right now throughout the world, I'm not even so many places.
Mm-hmm.
Is so important for, how do I say this? For Christians in the United States to be informed about history, about our foreign policy, and to listen to the voice of the poor.
Yeah. And I mean, and if that is the thing that we're called to do, and this is kind of, I think, where Romero moves in the letter is when he talks about the sincere cooperation and our service that demands conversion. It is this being with those on the margins.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we took like another place in the world, another conflict, I mean, Israel, Palestine, what if we just, instead of deciding who is right in terms of nation states, just looked at who's being marginalized and who's being hurt, and can we stand with them? I think we would parse it differently than the main narrative you hear a lot of the times. So.
Yeah, and something that for me, I think that's so key and I think this letter is perfect. Number one, for the Lent season we're entering.
Mm-hmm.
And number one, I think every Christian in America should read this letter. So if you can make that happen, James, through your podcast.
Oh yeah, because there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast.
But I think what I think for me what is so powerful about Romero's heart and theology is this, I don't know how to label it, but almost this incarnation of the good news, right? That there is, he says, that there is this paschal mystery that must take place in history. That if the word of God doesn't have anything to say to the here and now, then we as a church need to close our doors and walk away, because this is our God-given task, that this is what it means to be converted. This is what it means to live our sacramental liturgical life, is that there is this good news, but that without this really practical human element, both this, like Jesus, fully human, fully divine, that if our word is not human, then we're not living it.
If our word is not human, we're not living it. So this is, on the Easter theme. I mean, the second thing he says is that the church is the sacrament, and the instrument of Easter. Like, how do we embody that, I guess? Yeah.
Wow. I got to go. I got to go to Ireland to visit a community, a Catholic community that sat on what it's now called the Peace Wall, right? Divided the Protestants and the Catholics, as we labeled them, but really what it was is the colonizer and the native, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we drew these religious lines. But what was neat about this community is that they sat in the middle, and I took an Uber around there, and the driver said, "Well, where were you?" And I told him I was at this church, and he said, "Oh, I live on the other side of the wall from that church, and we always knew we never threw rocks at them because they never threw rocks at us."
Wow.
And I love that the church sat in the middle of both communities, and that became a place where both Catholic and Protestant clergy met to talk about the peace and to help build peace. And I wonder what it would look like if we as a church practice that more often, that in the midst of conflict, we provided safe places for both sides to meet. If it could be a safe haven, right, for enemies.
Yeah.
That would be for me a way of living this paschal mystery, death and resurrection. So I think it's going to be a big call for us as a church coming to November. I'm so heartbroken that we're becoming more polarized and siloed as Christian communities. I don't have a good solution.
Right.
I don't, but I wish that we could work together.
It is interesting to me because you just see the rhetoric of, I was on social media a couple days ago, and somebody who was, way more conservative than I was saying awful things about people who were progressive, and the response was just the same thing the other way, and nobody's listening to each other. And I think that we're in this time that it's really easy to demonize the other side, but it's a little bit harder to come to the table and break bread.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and Romero has a great line here. He writes that the church does not live for herself, but in order to bring the world the truth and grace of Easter. Right.
Mm-hmm.
That for me, I think that too long we've lived for ourselves here in the States.
Yeah.
And if we could embody that truth of Easter, of not living for ourselves, what would it mean for a church to not live for itself? What if we didn't live for a pension as ministers?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
What if we didn't live for maintaining a building that is falling apart? But what would it look like to love our neighbor deeply? You know?
Yeah. How many times have you seen that the conversation about caring for our neighbor is shortcutted, or at least short shrifted, because we're dealing with these other things, like of pensions and buildings and how we keep everything running.
Yeah.
Instead of how do we love our neighbor well?
Yeah. We invest 12 million in a sound system, and then neglect the poor, which I don't know how honestly how we'll answer to Jesus on that. We meet Jesus and ask us about the sheep and the goats. Where was he?
Yeah. So are there specific practices that when we consider this letter, like what should we do, Julio? Can you break it down for me? I'm not as smart as you, so I need somebody to.
Well, Sabrina was interviewed in Spain. Sabrina's probably close to the end of his life. He's, I think, 92, lives still in El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
But last time he was in Spain, he was interviewed, and they asked him, kind of about what is the future of Christianity, Christian spirituality, and he says, there's a one theologian says, that the future of Christianity is, oh my goodness, the word's escaping me, but one that is not so much head oriented, but more practicing in spirituality. It'll come to me as I keep going. But Sabrina says, well, I would like to add to that the future of spirituality and Christianity is to be in solidarity with the poor.
So is Karl Rahner that said something about the future of the church is a mystic?
Yes. That's right. Yeah. Sabrina's Rahnerian. That's right. Yeah. So Ella Curia and Sabrina are both students of Rahner. So the future Christianity is mysticism, and Sabrina added to that. So the future Christianity is one that's in solidarity with the poor.
Well, and those really do belong together. The mysticism should feed our desire to reach the world. With that, I've got to say, Julio, I know you. You're a pastor, but you're also an activist. You've been involved in a number of actions in your life, and you raise your voice on important issues, capital punishment being one of them, and some of the other issues that you live outside DC, so there's lots of opportunity to participate in the work of justice around there. But what are the things that nurture you for the work that you do?
Wow. I am honestly blown away by those who live in the most at-risk situations, oftentimes have the most hope. So I tell people, my church, when I preach, sometimes And I don't know if they understand what I'm saying, or I don't think I understand what I'm saying, to be honest with you, but I don't know if we can understand Jesus living in the wealthy world, even though I'm not wealthy, but I live in the wealthy world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like even Sabrina says, the wealthy world don't understand access to water. For us, said if the wealthy world runs out of water, they'll go to war for it.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we were in El Salvador this past summer. I partnered with another church in Georgetown, and we did an immersion trip, and a community hosted us. This is really amazing. They do a soy program in a poor area of El Salvador to provide nutritious meals. And my kids went to wash their hands before we ate because they provided a meal for us. And because I've been to El Salvador, I know, but they just turn on the water and start washing their hands. I ran over, like, no, 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 no. You don't understand how precious water is here. Access to water is so limited here. You don't just turn on the faucet and run it. What you do is there's a pool of water. We call it a pila. So the way that the sinks are in El Salvador is there's two sinks on each side in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
There's I don't know how to call it in English, a cistern where they collect water. So take a bucket. So the faucet is just there to fill the center full of water. And you take a bucket and you take the water out of the pool of water and you go to the sink part and you basically dip your hands to get wet, then you soap them up, and then you just use enough water to rinse it off. But those people are the most generous people you'll ever meet. They'll give you the shirt off your back. We met with these grandmothers. I wish you could meet them. The most beautiful little grandmothers. They fought their mayor to put in a water system in their community. The mayor refused. The mayor's given water for infrastructure. He just puts it in his pocket. So what they did was they dug and installed their own pipelines. And it's so funny because they would go to there was a German organization that was providing grants to dig wells. And the German company said, no, we already handed out our grants. You can't have a grant because we already met our limit. This little community said, well, we're going to keep coming to the meetings, They didn't get kicked out. Then one of the communities stopped going. And so then they said, well, because you've been coming to all the meetings, we're just going to wrap you in. And I say, what an amazing faith. If they told me no, I'd be like, oh, man, okay, I'm going to stop going. But they were just so persistent. Like I think about that parable of the persistent widow. These grandmothers were so persistent. And then we as a community asked them, what's it been like now having water for your community? And they said, our kids can go to school now because in the past they couldn't go because people would make fun of them because they smelled bad, because they couldn't shower. But now they can go to school. Another amazing thing is that we went to an organization that when you visit, they'll leave behind a gift. So we leave a little money, and that helps the community to function.
Yeah.
So this organization asked one time the community, what do you need? And they said, well, we need some chickens because we don't have enough protein. They said, well, we tried in other communities and it doesn't work because people eat the chickens. They said, no, no, no. The grandmother said, we're going to take care of the chickens. Just give them to us and we'll make sure we protect them. Well, when we visited them now, this community has like hundreds of chickens and they use the eggs as their protein. It's so amazing. And the director said to me, I can't believe it worked here. But these little grandmothers are tough little women. They don't let anybody eat the chickens. So I think for me, just like Romero said, the Salvadoran people make it easy to be a pastor. I say the people working for justice are the ones that make it easy for me to be involved in the work of justice. They give more than I can ever give. I've been blown away by the generosity and the love and the care.
And that's beautiful, Julio. I mean, honestly, like, I ask this question a lot, and usually I get some sort of spiritual practice, and that's all good. But like, this is really the heart of where Romero goes. Is it's this quality of relationship, of being with people, that kind of feeds his soul, and I think feeds your soul too. And that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, yeah. Come with me to El Salvador one day.
Oh, I'd love to.
When we
Uh,
when we win the lottery, let's go.
yeah. If people want to connect with the work of Óscar Romero, there is a online way that you can read this letter and other letters and homilies and everything for free at the Archbishop Óscar Romero Trust in the UK, and I'll put a link in the show notes for that. Because it's all. I think anything that he's written that's published is there. I don't know. Yeah. So,
and if you read Spanish, you're not gonna believe this. The University of Central America's theological journal is free.
oh wow, yeah,
It is unbelievable to read. I mean, I don't know why they do it for free, but I think it's the greatest gift to the world to read the journal. It's not published that often. I can't remember, maybe the last publication is not that recent, but there's wealth there. So a lot of Sabrina's writing. So Sabrina's a lot like Brueggemann, not Brueggemann, but he writes mostly articles. So the books that you read in English, if you can read Spanish, I recommend you reading all his articles in Spanish, because, and if you read in Spanish, I recommend you sitting with Salvadorians, because there's some contextual things that might not translate to Spanish. But there's a lot of neat things at the University of Central America that you can get. Also, the Plow Press provides for free Violence of Love PDF version.
yeah.
Which is a great access if you want to kind of jump in and read some of that. If you haven't seen the Romero movie, Raul Julia is the lead actor. That's another good one to watch.
That Romero movie, I know I watched it because I got it for free from my library. I could a digital download, but it is available lots of places, and if it's not on your streaming service, you could still probably get it. And if people wanted to connect with you though and your work, how would they go about that?
That's a good question. I'm at Christ Crossman UMC for the moment. You can email me, julio.hernandez@gmail.com, and drop me an email.
Cool. Well, thanks, Julio. I want to do this again sometime, because this was one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had for this podcast. So I appreciate you so much.
Oh, thank you, and I appreciate you too, and love to when we get to see each other in person again.
One of my personal practices that I do at least once a year, and often on Martin Luther King Day, is to read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. This was the letter that King wrote in response to 8 white clergy who thought that King's call for justice was stirring up trouble and dissension among the races in Birmingham. I find it necessary to revisit that letter, especially when I hear well-meaning people like me denounce a protest or a movement because of the ways they disrupt the status quo and cause an inconvenience to us. It helps remind me to not privilege my own comfort, but to really listen to those on the margins, those who are struggling for their rights, those who need justice. After talking to Julio, I think I'm going to add Óscar Romero's letter to the Easter Church to my list of repeat reads for the ways in which Romero learned to listen well to the Salvadorian people, to be the voice for the voiceless, and to stand with the poor. Thanks, Julio, for a great conversation. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, I invite you to leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And until next time, keep practicing.